Good evening. Welcome. This meeting of the Nottaway County Board of Supervisors will now come to order.
Good evening. This joint work session between the Nottaway County Board of Supervisors and School Board is now called to order.
Mr. Bowen, will you provide an invocation for us?
Yes, Madam Chair, we'll be glad. Let's go to the Father. Lord, again, we thank you for this time that we come together. And Father, it is the Christmas season, and we know that Jesus is the reason. And Father, we're so thankful. And Lord, we're thankful that over the years that you have put the hedge of protection on this county with our children. And we know there's so many other school systems that has not had that blessing. And so we lift those families up to you. We lift others that at this time of year, that people get depressed with the season, and we just lift them up to you, knowing that you're a loving God and you will take care of them. And now as we ask you to be with us tonight, and we thank you for all that you've done and the blessings that we haven't even recognized. It's through Jesus Christ we pray, and God's people said, Amen.
Amen. We stand for the pledge of allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Are there any revisions to tonight's agenda?
Madam Chairman, county staff has none.
Madam Chair, I move to approve with those minutes.
We have a motion for approval of the agenda. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Purpose of tonight's meeting of this joint work session is a comprehensive financial overview that will be provided by Davenport and Company, and we have Mr. David Rose, Senior Vice President and Manager of Public Finance. Mr. Rose?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. My partner, R.T. Taylor, will be with me. When I stray too far, he'll just kick me, and then after kicking me, he'll then answer the right things. I probably have a bruised shin by the time it's all over. But no, on a serious note, RT and I have had the opportunity to work together almost 20 years. So he probably doesn't look that old, but he certainly is. On a serious note, I want to say the reason we're here tonight is because of the respective leadership of both the county board as well as the school board. Dr. Grimes and Heather have been very helpful, as has been Ted Costin and Katie, who I understand is not here tonight, but again, was also very helpful. The overwhelming majority of information you're about to see, however, does come from the state. It's from their public information that we were able to glean and use. So again, it's really based upon factual information. I know you have a hard stop, so let me just make a couple more points. Number one, there's no action that we are asking of anybody. This is meant solely to be educational, and hopefully it'll be the start of some discussion as you move towards other deliberations, be it for the upcoming budget, which will be here before we know it, as well as the capital needs that you've identified to begin with from the Mosley report, which we have been given an opportunity to review. That said, all of you should have in front of you a book entitled Comprehensive Financial Overview. I will try not to go through every single page. The time does not permit that, but I want to give you the essence of what we did. So if you would, just go over to page 1, a little bit of background. For those of you who are not aware, I manage the practice at Davenport. This is my 25th year at the firm, my 42nd or so since coming out of school. We work with local governments, cities, counties, towns, and school boards. We were brought into the county by the interim manager, Mr. Anzavino, and he asked us to help look at some things. Subsequent to that, we made a presentation, which is publicly available, to the county board, talking about the overall county's finances. And we did that last year. from that, it was decided that it would be helpful as well to look at the schools since they are such a critical and important and sizable component of your overall budget. So that's what we have tonight, is the focus is going to be on the county schools. With that said, I'd like to just go to page 5 and start with a couple of pie charts just to give you a sense of the overall budget of the schools. This is the 23 budget that we used, and you'll notice there, I'm going to round off here, but basically a quarter of the revenues come from the county itself, 3/4 roughly come from the state. That said, taking a step further, the actual expenditures of the 23 budget are literally almost 82% operating funds, 60% salary, 21 or so percent benefits. That is similar to other peer schools throughout the Commonwealth. So point that out. There was nothing outlying here. What was slightly outlying, though, is the capital. It is under 2% of the overall expenditures, and that's because effectively there is essentially little de minimis amount of debt on the overall schools as part of the overall county finances. So on page 6, we started to look at the county schools and the financials going back some 5 years. And what we did was look at the main highlights of revenues versus the highlights of expenditures and try to see a pattern there as it relates to how the schools have operated. So what is the takeaway here? Number one, the first takeaway is the schools have operated within their budget. That's important. They've not been an outlier, but rather basically all of those years. 2020, $65,000 to the negative on a $20+ million budget is basically break even, and that's the important thing. But on the other years, it has been to the positive, and that's important. So again, the takeaways here. We found nothing atypical as it relates to revenue growth or expenditure growth that caused us to find concern. However, under line 19, you'll notice that debt has been zero. So any capital expenditures that have been done have been pay as you go. That is not typical of school systems in a state, and you're going to see how you compare to others within this area, as well as those in Region 8, which is, again, what is viewed by your peers, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. If you go to page 7, I want to talk about your local contributions. And what we mean by that is what the school board has been getting over those years from the county board. You may be aware, I think all of you in this room are, that there is a required local minimum, and that is set by the state, and all counties are required to follow that. So you'll notice here that under line 6, your required local minimum, you have always been above that, as you'd expect, but it has come down. It was as high as almost 123%, and this past year in the 2023 budget, it's basically almost right there at 100%. That number moves a little bit because of ANTC. We'll show you that in a few minutes, but by and large, you're moving towards that required local minimum. You'll also notice that your average daily memberships has been coming down. It's down about 3.7% since 2019. And again, that's something that makes it frankly more difficult when the actual numbers are coming down to operate the schools. because the way in which the state compensates you, as you know, is based upon your LCI. We'll get to that in a minute. And they multiply that by the actual number of students. So again, you are getting less dollars from that perspective if everything else is remaining equal. Okay, let's go to page 9. I indicated earlier, we like to look at you compared to peers. When we first did this analysis, we compared you to peers in what we call Region 4 of counties, and you'll see that on the next page in a moment. But Dr. Grimes and Heather indicated that we also would be more holistic if we added also all of those counties that were in Region 8. So what you'll see here is the combination of both Region 4 and Region 8. And so effectively, we have a dozen other counties that are used as the peers for everything you're about to see in the next few minutes. Again, we've got a lot of material. I'll move very quickly because of time pressures, but we certainly can add to or answer any questions now or later as time permits. So on page 10, you can see where Region 4 is above you. That's in that Kelly green. And then below, Region 8, somewhat overlapping and expanded. That is, again, as broken out by Department of Education school districts throughout the Commonwealth. So those are the peers that you're going to see in the next few moments. All right, page 11 is basically telling you what you're about to see. So I'm going to jump past that and get right to page 12 and talk about your composite index. What is your composite index? For those of you in the audience, maybe perhaps not as up to speed, I suspect you are, but nevertheless, the composite index ties back to the way in which you get compensated per student. And that composite index is based upon 3 factors that we list there in that first bullet. Having said that, your composite index is in the 2s. The lower your composite index, the more dollars you get per student. That said, the median is about 0.3, but you are there in the 0.26 area. That's going to be important later on when we talk about capital. And I'll get to that in a few moments, but keep that in mind because under our new administration in Richmond, they have created new laws or new regulations, I should say, tied into funding for capital, and any local school district and county that's under 0.299 will automatically be eligible for up to 30-year funding at fixed rate of 2%. And on top of that, unlike the old program, you will also get priority over what's viewed as higher composite index counties when you apply for money. Lastly, you are eligible today for up to $25 million per project of 2% money. It is partly first come, first served, and there's also a grant component to that, but that details have yet to be worked out. So we're going to talk about things in a few minutes that are tied solely to borrowing and excluding any potential for grants, not because we don't think it's possible, but we just don't know the exact nature of how that would come, what would be eligible, etc. So with that said, let's go to page 13 and let's talk about this local share, the local match that you're making. And you'll see here that basically in the 23 fiscal year, the median for these communities is about 6.8 million. You're at 5.1. I'm not sure that's something to say, well, we're below the median. That ties also back to your size. And so what I think really matters is not so much how you compare, just wanted you to see what it was, but really what you're going to see is how it compares to the required local match. And we'll show you that in a few minutes. So you'll see how everybody shakes out. On page 14, local contributions in your budget, basically, you are at basically 5.7 million. 5.3 of that is tied to instruction. 0.4 is tied to ANTC. Makes you a little bit different than all the others you compare to because of your hybrid status, if you would. Again, median is higher. Again, it's just the way it is. So then I think page 15 is a very important page. I think you'll agree with me. This is what your local share is, the percentage relative to the budget. And you'll see there the median is about 106%. You are effectively anywhere between 102, as I said earlier, and 110%. That 8 percentage points is tied to ANTC, which you're giving. So the takeaway here is that you look at the median, and most of them are right around 100 to 110%. Then you see some outliers that jump upwards of as high as 150%. Mecklenburg and Prince Edward up there, a few in the 120s, and then mostly others are going to be around 110 or lower. And just this is the takeaway there. While Lunenburg is at 98, that's only because at the time they did their submittals, if you would, they were required to be at 100%. It just happens to do with the actual fine tuning of it, but that's the way they're set up. So let's go to page 16, another, I think, very important perspective here, and that is how many dollars does each of these school systems, counties, budget for debt service? Earlier, I showed you your financials, you were at zero. The only other local government that's at zero is Amelia. Everyone else is at least at $600,000, and the median is a little over $1 million. So again, what we've got right now, I think one of the challenges is that there are no recurring dollars set towards debt service. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So then on page 17, we basically just wanted you to see what happens with your peers when you add the operational plus the debt service. As I said earlier, you are at 5.7. You're, of course, still at 5.7 because you only have one component, and that's the operations. The others, again, have added 600,000 and more to show the totals of budget of operations and debt service. Page 18, thought this was helpful as well as a perspective, and that is when you look at your general fund, and this now we're talking about the county's general fund, what percentage of the general fund goes towards supporting schools for expenditures? You're right there effectively at the median. When I say you, meaning the county board is right there at the median. Okay. So then what we have on page 19 is a series of peer comps that you may want to delve into a little bit later. But we've tried to touch on a variety of topics that could be helpful to you. Average daily membership, you're right there at the median. County populations, once again, very much similar. Then on page 20, though, we did find what's somewhat concerning to us is that the average daily membership and population trends, with the exception of Brunswick, your ADM has been shrinking at a greater level than anyone else short of Brunswick, and the overall population trend for many of these in the Region 4 and in the Region 8 has been to the negative. A few have been on a positive side, such as Appomattox, even Amelia, but by and large, and Dinwiddie, but by and large, a lot of them have been somewhat into the negative category. Next page, 21. We then tried to delve into looking at what we'll call the efficiencies of the school information, the way the schools are operating. And there was some interesting things that we learned about the school system here in the county relative to others. First is just the number of instructional positions. You were right there on the median. Then when we looked at the ADM per instructional positions, again, you were very close to the median. So nothing jumped out at us to say that this is either bloated or it's underfunded or something that was problematic. We did not see that. We did not see that. Then what we did see on page 22, though, was interesting. And we don't pretend to know the genesis of all this. And this is why, again, it will be helpful for you all to digest this and to think about it. But the average annual salaries for instructional positions, you actually were significantly above the median. You were actually the high of all these entities, all these counties, I should say. And both average salaries for teaching positions also had you at the high end of this. So again, something that was enlightening to us. The next page, though, your total cost of operations, however, you were right there on the median. Your total cost of operations on a regular day, right there at the median. And I think what we're going to be leading to in a couple of moments is page 24. What we did find, though, is your operations personnel per school, you were lower than the median. So when we delved further and looked at the classification on the right-hand side, what we found is that your admin, your technical, we'll call it your main office for school personnel, if you would, is actually lower than the others. And we especially saw that when it came to assistant principals and things of that nature. And we're going to show you that. So if anything, the school system here is heavily on the teaching side, but lower on the front office side. And I've understood you've been working towards some things to sort of catch up. And you'll see that on page 25. When you look at the total number of schools, you've got 5, the median's 4. But on the right-hand side, what's very interesting to us is that the median is basically pretty much, it's a 1-for-1. You have, 5, if you have 4 schools, you tend to have personnel 4 or 5. You see that, but with you have 5 schools and 2.3, if you would, assistant principals, secondary support. So you're actually a very distant from, let's say, Dinwiddie, having 7 schools, 8 support. Halifax, 9 and 9. Mecklenburg, 8 and 10. So if anything, you are, I think, on the low end as it relates to leadership, numbers of leadership in the schools themselves. Next page. Average annual salaries for principals, you're basically very close to the median. Assistant principals, you're again a little bit above that median, but nothing outlying, as you could see when we really delve into this. So that was another takeaway that we saw. So lastly, accreditations on page 27. We then delved into passing rates. We looked at various areas. I think because of time purposes, I'm going to skip over a number of those pages. You could see that. We can't speak to any of that. That's not our world of finance. But again, hopefully this is helpful for the board. It's helpful for the school board as well to see how you do really compare to others and all of that. So what I'd like to do now is pivot with the last few minutes remaining and what we call looking forward. And what we did under page or tab A on page 33 is we tried to understand the situation as it relates to those facilities that we alluded to. And so what we then did was take a little deeper dive. And if you go to page 34, we were able to look at and realize that your existing facilities range from 30 to 70 years in age. You've repurposed one elementary school. Your most recent additions have been in athletic fields and what have you, facilities. Recent renovations, the word recent, go upwards as far back as 25 to 40 years ago. So we understood that you commissioned, the school board, a facilities review by Mosley, and they did that. And so on page 35, we were able to see all of your different facilities, the 5 of them above the line, and then 6 through 17, some other elements of improvements. We could see when the renovations occurred, what they were for, etc. All of that by way of saying that you then received some information from Mosley. We looked at that information, and what we then realized on page 37 was a few critical pieces. Number one, what Mosley did not do was did not prioritize projects. They identified projects. They identified the rough dollars for those projects. They also did not identify a timetable or a sequential timetable, what have you. What they basically said was there was a half a dozen different options. Some were offshoots of others. And the numbers of dollars they identified ranged from 28 million up to 160 million. But of the 5 distinct, we'll call it options or sub-options, almost all of them, 4 of the 5, were in the 30 to 40 million dollar range. The one that was at 160 was literally something, as best as we could tell, and you correct me, RT, was almost like revamping and rethinking the entire series of campuses. And again, no sense of timing and priority, what have you. So what we did based upon our experience working with your neighbors and others is said, you know what, let's just try to look at and give you a perspective of what the dollars might mean, what the impacts might mean if we looked at something closer to something that was more likened to $30 million. And again, that may not be enough. So on page 38, what we said was, and by the way, we are happy to be criticized for the way we did this. This is not necessarily the right way to look at this, but what we tried to do was to say to ourselves, okay, if Nottoway County right now has $0 going towards debt service, what if we were akin to effectively the lowest denominator? And that was basically $600,000. As I said earlier, with the exception of Amelia, the other few at the lowest end were 600,000. So then we further revised that and said, what about if we just have $500,000 to go towards, let's say, debt service, even though the peer group is at $1.1 million. We did that, and then we said, since the peer group's at $1.1 million, what if we said, all right, let's assume you had magically $500,000 available, or then you had $1 million available. So we asked ourselves, how much could that buy us in terms of capital? How much could that work for us? Think of it this way. If you were to be in a mode where you're looking at purchasing a home and you said, I have $1,000 a month or $12,000 a year to go towards a mortgage, or I have twice that amount, $24,000 a year, $2,000 a month. That's sort of what we did here on your basis. So we then took it a step further and said, okay, what is a reasonable amount of time to pay back that borrowing? And we said, you know what? We'll use 30 years. Why? Because in the recently come out regulations by the state, by the Department of Education, by this new governor, he is giving us the ability, they are giving us the ability to borrow money up to 30 years. So we decided, let's mirror that. It meets best practices, and so we did that. We then took it a step further and said, okay, what if we have to borrow at prevailing rates? Prevailing rates are a little bit under 5%, so we took the liberty of saying, let's use 5%. However, we also then said, what if we are able to get the 2% money that is being talked about? And so what we then have is a table here. And let's start with basically this. If it's 5% money and it's 30-year repayment, and we have $500,000 to start, we can do basically about 7.7, let's say $7.5 million of capital we can fund. And that's about 25% of your needs. However, if we are able to do 2% money, and we think you can, we believe there is a justification and a pathway to do that, you're able to do over $11 million of funding. Now, we have not tried to say that $11 million is all done over 5 or 10 years. We've acted as if it's all or nothing, just because we're trying to give you a sense of that for the purpose of the meeting today. What's interesting, though, is if you get to the median, that $1 million or slightly under, at 2%, you basically get 3/4 of all the needs identified by Mosley. Now, again, I've taken a huge leap. The $30 million may not be adequate with all the inflation. The $30 million is not necessarily ratcheted up for inflation, so that if some of those needs occur and happen 5 or 7 years from now, undoubtedly that $30 million request could be $40 million. But again, I think the takeaway here is that between $500,000 and $1 million that it could be earmarked strategically towards debt, you have the ability to do quite a bit. And so if, for example, in some of those projects that we saw that needed $2, $3, $4 million, the takeaway here is that a relatively modest amount of dollars dedicated to capital can go a long way towards taking care of your most emergent needs, which I don't pretend to know what they are, but you do. And again, the thought here is to have this as a discussion moving towards your upcoming budget. The one last thing I did not point out, and I should have, it's my fault, is this. Your annual required contribution by the county here, and this is important for the citizens to hear, has gone up considerably. It's what the state has required. And if you go back to that financial trends, page 6, and I'll stop at this point, but if you go to page 6 and you look at county contributions, line 7, you'll notice that in 21, it was 4.6 million. In 22, it was 4.9 million. And in 23 budget, it's 5.6 million. So what has been required just to be roughly at about 100% or slightly over 100% required this board, your board here on the left-hand side, to go up some $700,000 in 22 versus 23 fiscal years. So I think one of the cautions for the board, and we're going to want to take a hard look at this for the 24 fiscal year, is what will that number be that the local contribution has to be and we've got to see how that compares to the natural growth of revenues, because this county board does not have a choice. It has to do something akin to that, if not more, just to meet the requirements of the state for its respective school board. With that, I will stop. RT, anything you want to add if I've not? You sure? Okay. I will stop here. Dr. Grimes, Mr. Costin, happy to try to answer any questions of anyone, but I know the two of you have heard this before, so I'll just throw it out. Thank you.
I've got a question. First, an observation. This is an awful lot to be thrown at us, and, I haven't digested even a small fraction of it. And so I'm not totally up to speed on everything that you just said. But if you'd like to hear my takeaway, I'd be happy to tell you.
Of course, but let me just say this, just to make sure, Mr. Outlaw. This was basically meant, as I said, to start a dialogue, start some perspective, allow your two boards to get even closer. I will tell you the cooperation between Ted and Dr. Grimes was terrific, as well as the staff people. So again, I knew, because you got a hard stop, I certainly can talk for 4 or 5 hours, but I don't expect anybody to digest it and listen and want to hear it. But it's just meant to be a starting point. And that's why, again, there's a whole lot of information here. So, yes, thank you.
And I think by and large, talking to some of what you just said, we've got a pretty good relationship with the Board of Supervisors. And, but my takeaway on this is that because we don't have debt, we're behind the 8 ball.
Yeah.
That's hard for me to wrap my mind around. I mean, if my neighbor's $10,000 in debt and I'm got 0 debt, I'm not keeping up with the Joneses.
Not quite. I like your thinking. Here's the difference. Unfortunately for you and I'm in my mid-60s. I have a final ending date.
I wish I was in my mid-60s.
But I'm saying, unfortunately, for you as a county or as a school board, it's perpetual. There is no end date. So what it means to me when I see a local government having no debt outstanding, what that really means to me is that you've been so wealthy and so able to pay cash for everything that you don't have to have debt, which is ideal. That would be the best of all worlds. Or it tells me that basically there's a lot of deferred maintenance. There's a lot of things that need to be taken care of, because even the wealthiest counties in this state that I happen to be fortunate to work with, like Loudoun County, which has the highest median household income in the entire country, still has a significant amount of debt tied to schools and other things, because the theory is that those that use it will pay for it. And when something is going to have the ability to last for 20, 30, 40, or 50 years, you want to basically not overburden one particular user of that particular day, but spread it out. So it goes to that concept, not quite perfect, but the same idea of a mortgage. Again, you and I are a little different, as in all of us, meaning you and I, there is an end date for us. We don't want to be saddling our children with debt of ourselves, of our own, in terms of, I'm fortunate to have a home and I've been fortunate to pay it off. But as a local government, as a school, as there's constantly new students, new lifeblood, new classes, the key is, are we staying current with the facilities? And only you can address that. All I could see from the Mosley report, again, is there is tens of millions of dollars that they identified, not me, that they identified that need to be taken care of. So that begs the question, are you sitting on tens of millions of dollars as a county that you could go towards? And the answer is no. You're in a good position. I showed that to the county board. But you certainly don't have tens of millions of dollars to just take care of that when you also have other county needs that have nothing to do with the schools that also have to be factored in for this board to wrestle with. And that is things like animal shelters, the public, public safety. That's a mandated requirement of the state and the federal government. The overall courthouse / administration facilities doesn't meet ADA standards and other things like that. So that's why I bring up this concept that there is, from my world, there is debt can be viewed as a crutch or debt can be viewed as a tool. And I think there is a happy balance here to make debt a strategic tool as opposed to a crutch. One last thing I mentioned earlier, so here's interesting, Lena. If you're able to use debt and get debt at 2%, guaranteed fixed rate for 30 years, right now, you're able to reinvest the cash that you have in the county government. You can invest in 6-month United States Treasury. You can't get any safer than that. And you will get 3.5% on your money. So from a strategic standpoint, it makes no sense whatsoever to use money of the county that they can earn 3.5% on and grow it and not use 2% money guaranteed for 30 years. So, and not to do 30 years, but to basically do that. So that's, that would be my response to you, but I understand where you would look at that because yes, when you and I compare ourselves to our neighbors, if we can have no debt, we are definitely better off than our neighbors. But unfortunately, we have an end date. This county, this country of ours, good Lord willing, has no end date. It's just constantly need to be reinvested.
Well, thank you for that. That clarifies a lot of things and in my mind puts a lot of this in a better perspective.
And one last thing I would like to add, Mr. Outlaw, one of the recommendations that we made when we did the general government comparative that you certainly would very much enjoy if you haven't seen it, is we recommended, and we're going to be doing that this year if they don't throw me out, and that is to put together a series of financial policy guidelines that tie into best practices so that the county, if it does embark on some debt borrowings, doesn't go hog wild and doesn't just use that not only as a tool, but as a crutch. And so we talked to the board about making sure that we have certain parameters. And that's the same going back to the peer group and some national indices so that, again, the irony is right up the road, if you look at Petersburg, which we got brought in by the governor's office a few years ago to help them, we're still involved. When Petersburg has had all their problems, it was actually not tied to levels of debt. They actually had very little debt outstanding. They had other issues. They had an imbalance structurally in revenues not to meet expenditures, of which very little turned out to be debt service. So it's interesting when you really look closer. I want to make sure, especially since y'all are not so far away from the Petersburg area, that someone says, well, we don't want to end up like Petersburg. Yes, we get that, but it's not because of debt that got them in trouble.
Mr. Rose, if I could get a 60-second speed round with you here real quick. First of all, to Mr. Outlaw's point, I think the maintained way of working in the past is hurting us now. We've got a good reserve for pent-up needs. It looks like kind of where we've been going to. But if I understand you correct, low composite index means more money per student from the state, but for lack of better terms, means the county's poor in a sense.
By their criteria, that the 50, 40, and 10, those three pieces, you are on the poorer end, because what happens is they take those three pieces, they put that together, and that number is then compared to statewide, all the other counties, which I think at last count, pretty sure it was 95 counties and something like 40 some odd, cities. And when you combine them, there's something like about 135 or so school districts. And so that puts you, that 2.6 that you're talking about, Mr. Orr, yes, puts you on, from their perspective, on the poorer end. Whereas, for example, Loudoun County has a perfect 8. It's nothing higher. They're at 8. That's the highest. That's right.
Okay, and if I followed the report correctly, the salaries are pretty much on the top of the list according to the state's report. Is that accurate or is that wrong?
It is accurate. As best as we saw, yes, that was taken from the state information that RT and I have. Yes, sir.
And to the Moses report, did you find it helpful? And if not, what may have been helpful that was missing?
Yeah, what would have been helpful, and again, I'm not been any part of the Mosley report. Again, I just got it to see it afterward. So I have no input on any of that. Didn't even know it was being procured. That's fine. Of course, wouldn't expect to. It's not my purview. But I think what would be helpful would be to prioritize as well as to adjust it for the timing and inflation and some strategies. So said a different way, when I looked, and you correct me, RJ, how many different, like, what was it, like a dozen, 15 or 16 different, how many would you think different things? they had?
It was over a dozen.
Over a dozen different, we'll call it projects. And so none of them had, this is priority 1, 2, 3, or anything like that. And it didn't have the timing. So there's no sense for me of, okay, if you did, let's say, project number 1, what has to happen, let's say, with moving students, if they have to move students or something like that. So there's no sense in that report, as best as I could tell, of some sequential consequences and, of information. So I think that, and that's not being critical of the report. I think that's just part 1. So now you go to, with all of that they find, it seems to me then goes back to the various parties to say, okay, now let's start talking about sequential. Let's talk about priorities. That's the next natural step there. Because like I said, you might find that you may all agree that the first 2 projects, for argument's sake, are a total of, just go, $7 million. And they would take 2 or 3 years to implement, so that as a result, we might not need $500,000 to be earmarked in, let's say, some upcoming fiscal year. It might be $200,000 in that first fiscal year and another $200,000 in the next couple of fiscal years. That's would be helpful to us.
Right, and I know the school board got a full plate, with what's going on with ANTC. And this next question, I think kind of everything may pivot off of part of that is, did you see anything in there, the report that was recommended for surplus? Because like I said, with the future of ANTC, they have a facility studies along with this finance study. Did you see anything in there?
I don't remember that.
I
Do you
don't
remember?
remember.
We don't remember that. And if I'm wrong, maybe there is, Dr. Grimes, I don't know if there's anything that's surpluses. I'd love to talk to surpluses.
No, there was nothing in the facility
Okay.
study related to surplus. And the facility study was not designed to provide a prioritization or strategies. It was designed to look at the facilities that we have, identify their use instructionally, and then the school board will take that information and prioritize where it wants to focus. And the projects listed were based upon feedback, suggestions, thoughts from the public comment and public engagement sessions that occurred during the study.
Do you have any other questions?
I'm sure this will be a little bit maybe, and I know Mr. Rose don't have involved in looking to each other in the future. But, so if you go to page 12, so I'm just asking this question, this might be, and that composite index drives me crazy. It's just one of those things that I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. So we're gonna do, so you look at the top, it says, I see that 50%, 40%, 10%. 50% is the true value of real property. Does it, when we reassess every 6 years, other counties are doing 4 years, 3 years, some counties are going every year, and we've always been 6 years. Well, first of all, it's very costly to do it, but does that help us or hinder us?
So think of it this way,
All right.
if the true value were to double, then your composite index could potentially or would to some degree go up, go higher. If it goes higher, you then get less dollars per student. So in some ways, that does not help.
Right, I get you.
Not help.
Your tax base goes down.
And depending on when you reassess how the economy is going, which way that might go too.
Yeah, and you're very correct. So for everybody's benefit, in Virginia, the longest period of time you can go is 6 years. In North Carolina, it's 8 years. Typically, more smaller local governments tend to be on the 4 to 6 year because it is very expensive. It's very time consuming. It requires outside folks getting brought in. Why some places that are bigger tend to do it, for example, every year,
Right.
is because, again, so much changes potentially every year that they don't want to lose what could be the upside, and they also don't want to overdo what might be the downside in a given year if, let's say, values go down. So, for example, I'm from Richmond. There were several years in a row where the assessed values went down.
Right.
But to wait, let's say 4 years, and you happen to get one bad particular year, and you had to wait 4 years, you potentially would lose a lot of dollars, or you might overtax people a lot of dollars. So that's why those places tend to do it much more frequently, and they're set up that way anyway. They're set up with full-time commissioners, to do
Okay.
that.
So David, on that same page then, this is what concerns about time, sometimes finance timing is, so let's say Dr. Grimes at the school board says, hey, we really like to try to get this capital project done here. And we're doing a reassessment this year. But I see here, if we, right now with 0.66, we're below 3.0. So we get better interest rates if we lower, is that?
So it's, okay, so here's when the word better interest rates, anything, the 0.266
Right.
is now going to be, is going to stay for 2 years. That's how it works, irrespective of when
Okay,
you do your reassessment.
right.
That got set this past July, and it'll be for the next 2 years. That's how it works. So even if all of a sudden, let's say reassessment got done 3 months from now, and it blew the doors off of this, and you would go from 0.2, internally you would do this, but the state doesn't calculate this but every 2 years.
Okay.
So the other thing is, if this is really a call to action, I'll tell you why. Because if you do go above that 0.299, let's say 2 years from now, the way the new regulations are written for the literary loan program, it does not mean you'll get 3% money. That's what it used to mean. And anyone in the twos got 2% money. Anyone in the threes, 3%, 4, and then and so on. That's no longer the way it's set up. When you go to the 3 or higher, you kind of get thrown in a collective basket with everybody else. And that's also to be shaken out. That may ultimately be 3%. The only thing for certain that the new regs have said is that everybody that's under 0.299 will get 2% money. That's what has been provided. Okay. And will get priority. And that has nothing to do with any possibility of getting grant dollars, because there's another pot of money that this administration has now created of grant dollars. And that's going to be competitive, but it's meant to be competitive and skewed towards those whose composite index are on the lower end. So another way, they want to be helpful to Nottoway quicker than they want to be helpful to Loudoun County.
Gotcha.
And they make no bones about it. They say that because of the relative wealth.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Rose, to Steve's point there, though, something like a solar farm could push Nottoway over the limit, correct?
It could. Again, I don't pretend to know what, again, I don't know, Ms. Rohr, if it will, I mean, that's not my world, but if
Yeah,
it
'cause I thought I
does,
saw something, I read
again.
somewhere where one of the solar farms pushed one of the counties up.
It does,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
well, good, yeah. Yeah, you don't.
But also the offset there in that discussion would be that comes with potential revenues, right?
Right.
So
You have to
it's
compare that
sort of a
apples to apples,
mitigating
yes.
factor.
And I'll give you an example. So yesterday, we've been working we were commissioned by Emporia Greensville, which has sort of a joint, technically it's Greensville County, but it really is a joint schools. Well, what happened was, up until about 3 years ago, both Emporia and Greensville had a composite index in the twos. But when Greensville got the Dominion plant, theirs went from in the twos to 4.
Yeah.
So what happened then, or happening now, is they get less dollars per student. But while that's not great, the amount of dollars they get relative to the overall is so much greater. The economic development, the dollars that the plant is kicking off makes that other, it dwarfs it.
Right.
So they're better off, So goes to your point, RT, is that,
Yep.
solar farm, whatever.
Mr. Rose,
Yes, sir.
you talked about salary scales and said that our salary scales were high. But when I look at comparison in Lunenburg, Brunswick, Amelia, Prince Edward, Dinwiddie, which are all borders, there's only one county that we're higher, and that's Lunenburg, has a 0-step salary for a teacher. Everybody else around us is higher than us in reference to salary. Dinwiddie's at $50,000 a year. Prince Edward's at $45,000 a year.
What page? What page are you on?
Salary.
22, but he's looked up salaries.
He's not, okay, all right, I can see that.
And the salaries, these are the counties that we compete against that are right around us. As I was saying, Dinwiddie's at $50,000 a year, step 0. Prince Edward's $45,000 a year, step 0. Amelia's $46,000 a year, step 0.
Yeah, I was just saying, RT made a good point. It doesn't split out the steps. It's all brought together, that's all.
I understand what you're saying is all put together, but when we have to look at how do we compete to get teachers, we have 18 teacher positions open right now. A lot of those teaching positions have been open all year long. And if we can't attract people in, you're telling us that we are above the salary scale, when actually, when we look at comparison, we're not even meeting. The only people we can beat out is Lunenburg. So we have to truly look at the true numbers of what we bring our people in, because wherever you bring them in, it's a slow progression from 0 to make money, a slow progression.
Yes, sir. And the information that's available from the state's website sort of it's not detailed to break out if it's a long tenured, if you're overweighted in the longer tenured folks versus the younger folks. So it's a blend at the state level. So that is to say, maybe there's another county on here that has more, call it 2 to 5 year teachers versus
Exactly.
10 to 20
Exactly.
year teachers.
But
So
that's-
just so you,
And I
Yes,
get
sir.
your point. I was we represent the city of Pittsburgh, and was with the mayor, and we're talking about that same thing in they have labor negotiations there. And the irony is that the older officers, this is tied in with the police, they were not excited about giving a lot of dollars to the first 3 years. They cared more about the back end. So it all ties to what you say. Your challenge, it sounds like, is those early years or what have you. It just depends. That's more details than, again, we were able to get from. But your point is, we don't doubt it for a moment. We hear you.
But I don't want to give anybody the wrong information in reference to if we top weighted and our salaries are up there. And we don't need to adjust our salaries, because we do.
Mr. Rice, I have a question. On page 15, when we're looking at budgets as a percentage of local match.
Yeah.
Would the actual revenues, or at least local share contributions as a percentage of revenues, would that have any relevance here?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
If counties have as a percentage of their budget, or their budgets are a higher percentage of local match, if we're below median.
Right.
Would the revenues of those counties, if they had significantly higher revenues than Nottaway County, would that be a factor of any
Go to that page.
I think you want to look for that question and that line of thinking. I think you want to look at page 18, which looks at the other counties, or all the counties, including Nottaway, and says, okay, here's our percentage of our revenues or budget or what have you, this is how much of our budget we're spending on education. And so for Nottoway, that's 26.2 out of your overall, general fund budget.
Which is
How much?
right at the median, even
Correct.
though our local, our budget as a percentage of local share is lower.
Well, in
Well,
fairness,
it's right on the
it's right,
median.
it's right on the median. I mean, you're
At
right.
102.3, you're right on the median. So again, it's comparative in what you're asking, meaning how are we funding versus that state calculation? You're right at the median. And then if you look at your budget compared to other folks, how much are we funding as a percentage of our budget? How much are we putting toward education? So you're right on the median again.
Okay.
So in both cases, you're a tick above the median on both graphs. Does that help?
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's basis.
So then, and I'm not advocating against anything, but then if we take on, let's say, $1 million a year in debt service, then as a percentage or
It'll go
budget
higher. That's right. I get it.
expenditures will go above. Is that correct?
It will go above. You'll be above. Yes, exactly. You will be. And remember too, different local governments have different ways of also funding on behalf of schools. Again, it can come from other sources. So we have one county, and again, special sales taxes. We also have situation, one where it's basically landfill dollars that takes care of, lots of dollars for all the schools. King George County is that way. They do about $6-7 million a year coming directly from a dedicated tax.
So it might be reasonable for the Nottoway to look at different sources of funding.
Yes. Yes.
That's like this treasury note you were talking about.
I'm so dead.
That's like moving the money into treasury notes, like a 6, 12, 18, or 2-year treasury note. Because if 3.5 is my math correct, that every $1 million you could get 35,000 a year interest. Is that right? So, like
Correct.
all right, I'll just yank some out the air. The LRA money, you take $4 million of that, put it in a 2-year treasury note, and Nottoway in those 2 years will collect us $280,000 on the
Right.
2-year note.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. And that is the lowest risk to invest money. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Lowest risk.
Yeah, you can't do any better than, if our government fails, everything else fails. Nothing matters.
$33 trillion a day.
Are there any other questions this evening?
It's just a comment. I'd like to thank Dr. Grimes for not looking at us and saying, I told you so, when they are low on assistant principals. So you did really good on that. I'm very thankful, but it's really showed on report on that. So anyway, because she has been, and the school board has mentioned many times about being assistant principals.
Madam Chair, the last thing I have here is, I understand that there's a lot of moving parts to this, a lot the school board wants to dabble into with this. But I think it's important for the school board to know, and I'm only speaking for myself here, guys, that I just feel like with the priority list coming from the school board and a time frame, I'd be in favor to support the school system with a reasonable, financially sound request for necessary improvement, especially if we're using something like the governor has available here now. And the reason why I state that is because, we need to do what's best for our children, as you guys are aware of. But I think, just from my perspective, if y'all got something reasonably sound to move forward with, hey, I got you back. That's not me.
You'll go listen to the public, John.
Yes.
Any other questions this evening, any comments?
I like what Mr. Moore said, you gotta listen to the public. But you also gotta listen to what you have to do for kids. And the public may not all agree with that.
You're right.
Because you got some people that don't have students in the school system anymore, and they may not agree with spending that money or taking it out alone to do anything. But you don't know the conditions of the schools and the conditions of what our students need. And that's what we have to do. That's our job, is to make sure we get what we need for our students. And it's your job to fund it.
And when running for election, we hear
well, we hear it a lot of times, but we hear it especially when running for election, when we talk to the constituents about, you know, what their concerns are. And sometimes you will have older residents who are like, well, my children have been out of the school system for a long time and I don't want my taxes to go up. And, you know, it's that fine balance.
I've already heard it.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I was saying, like,
Right,
with something
exactly,
reasonable that
exactly.
can be presented, and of course, you
And
know.
we've got months of budget talks and everything else and prioritizing, and so hopefully all of that will come out of some of our budget workshops. So I appreciate that.
Mr. Rose, Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, appreciate being here. Thank you, have a good Christmas, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you, guys.
much. Be
Safe
careful
trip back.
going home.
Thank you.
Any other closing comments from either school board members or members of the board of supervisors? Do we have a motion to adjourn the board of supervisors?
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second, all in favor?
Do we have a motion to adjourn the school board meeting?
So moved.